If I could be deathly honest with everybody, I just learned that I had to speak this afternoon, yesterday evening. So this is very much off the cuff. But anyway, it's glad to have a chance just to share. Maybe I can just begin with a word of prayer, and then I'll just share a little bit about my story. And then we can open up if there are questions or thoughts that you might have. I'm happy to have a dialogue with everybody. Okay? Yeah. Father, we thank you for this afternoon, for this chance. Although unprepared, yet, Lord, we know that you are in control. And even our unpreparedness, Father, you prepare our hearts, and you can bless this time and make this time a time of eternal value. We commit ourselves to you. We commit this time into your hand. In Christ's name. Amen. Amen. Well, that voice you were hearing is my wife's voice, so I'm a bit distracted, I guess. She has a workshop on worshiping in spirit and in truth. Well, my name is Jamie Taylor. That's not my given name. My passport name is James Hudson Taylor IV. And if you know anything about perhaps mission history, you might be familiar with the name Hudson Taylor. His full name was actually James Hudson Taylor. And while he did not name any of his children James Hudson, his eldest son Herbert, my great-grandfather, named his son, or one of his sons, James Hudson Taylor II. Who then named one of his sons, James Hudson Taylor III, who then named one of, his only son, James Hudson Taylor IV, which is me. And we have a son, and you can guess what his name is. You can obviously tell we have a lack of imagination. But our math is... Can you everybody hear me okay?
Yep.
All right, we'll just leave this. Yeah, tell me welcome with that. Now we have a son, James Hudson Taylor V, and he informed us if they have a son, it will be the sixth. So we're trying to run alongside Henry VIII. That might not be so good, but anyway, yeah. But together with my two sisters, we were born and raised in Taiwan. My parents were missionaries. They went to Taiwan in 1955, and my sister was born that year in the southern city of Pingtung. And then subsequently my second sister, my second oldest sister, and then I was born in 1959, so you can do the math on how old I am this year. They were with the Free Methodist Church, which is a smaller denomination here in the United States, and served in Taiwan for about 25 years, and then went on to serve in Singapore, and then eventually spent about 18 years in Hong Kong. Growing up in Taiwan obviously was a very interesting experience for me, although I didn't have anything to compare it with, so it's really the only experience I've ever had. But my parents very intentionally integrated me into Chinese society, and they did that by simply making a decision that has affected my whole life, and that is they decided not to place me in international school and do my elementary education in English, but rather they placed me in a local Chinese school. So together with my sister, we were the only two non-Chinese in the whole school. But that meant that we actually grew up speaking Chinese, Mandarin Chinese that is, and that obviously has greatly impacted my whole life, just because of eventually the Lord leading me into full-time ministry to serve among the Chinese. But maybe I could just back up just very briefly some of you might not even know who Hudson Taylor is, and that's okay. But he was an early missionary to China. He went actually to China when he was 21 years old. He left England in 1854 and spent the next 50 years or so in China. He eventually started an organization called the China Inland Mission, which was an interdenominational mission. That is, it wasn't Baptist or Methodist or Presbyterian. It was interdenominational. It was also a faith mission, and that is, they believed, or he believed, that God's work done in God's way would never lack God's provision. And so he believed very strongly that we didn't need to ask people for money, that we needed to pray and trust that the Lord would provide. And so that's how he started the China Inland Mission, which eventually grew to some 800 missionaries right across China. Its focus was on the inland, thus China Inland Mission. But before actually he went to China, his parents, even before he was born, dedicated their son to be a missionary to China, which was quite an amazing thing back then, because China was very far away. Actually, it took Hudson Taylor 163 days by boat to get to China. That's probably the same, taking a slow boat to China. Maybe that's where that saying came from. But even before he was born, his parents decided to dedicate him to full-time ministry, to missionary service to China. And so when he was 21, that is what happened. He went to China and began to serve. One of the amazing things about Hudson Taylor was that he was very sensitive to the Chinese. And one of the things that he did early on in his missionary experience was that he took off Western clothing, and in order to, as much as possible, relate and identify with the Chinese, he would wear Chinese clothing. This was back in the Qing dynasty, and so clothing back there, they had Chinese gowns and robes. They also grew a queue. All males had to grow a queue. And so Hudson Taylor took off his Western clothing and put on his Chinese clothing so that he can identify with the Chinese. It's interesting, when I went back and read the history, what really was sort of the impetus behind that is one day, as he was preaching, he was still in Shanghai, where he first landed. He was preaching, he had already started learning the language. He was preaching, and he noticed this gentleman was very curious about his clothing. And especially, I'm not sure what kind of coat he had on, but at any rate, he had 2 buttons in the back of his coat, on the small of his back. There were these 2 buttons. And so this Chinaman, this Chinese gentleman, was just very, very curious about what were these 2 buttons for. And so after Hudson Taylor finished preaching, this Chinese gentleman came up to him and said, you know, Mr. Taylor, why do you have these 2 buttons on the back of your coat? And of course, Hudson Taylor couldn't read a lot, couldn't answer the question, because he didn't really know why he had those 2 buttons on the back of his coat. It'd be similar to if you wear a suit jacket today. I don't know if you've ever noticed, they also have buttons on their sleeves. Some have 3 buttons, some have 4 buttons. I wonder if you've ever asked yourself, what are those buttons for? And I've not yet come up with a very good answer. I went online to check it out. Some people, I heard one answer, take it or leave it, a very interesting answer. They said actually the buttons didn't originally they weren't on the bottom of their sleeve, they were on the top of the sleeve. And the reason that they were on the top of the sleeve is to keep people from using their sleeves to wipe their nose. I guess maybe people can't carry around handkerchiefs, or in Chinese we say shou pa. They didn't carry around these things. That's it right there. And so they would use their sleeves to wipe their noses, and so they put these buttons on the sleeves, and eventually somehow they fell from the top to the bottom. That was one of the answers I saw on the internet. Take it or leave it. Don't believe everything we read on the internet is probably the best answer. Of course, somebody else said, well, if a button in the middle falls, then you have a number of spare buttons to bring across, but the sides are different too. So anyway, maybe they're just for aesthetic reasons, fashion statement. But so Hudson Taylor was, this Chinese gentleman was just very curious as to why he had these two buttons on the back of his coat. And so that troubled Hudson Taylor, because he suddenly realized that this person was more curious about his clothing than the message that he was trying to share. And so he decided that that was enough. And so he took off his Western clothing and put on Chinese clothing so that he could identify with the Chinese as much as possible. He grew a queue. And so in my family, we actually have a strand of his hair that has been passed down from generation to generation. I don't bring it out very often just because he had enough hair to cut, and I obviously don't have enough hair to go along with. But that has always stuck in my mind, that kind of identification, which is so very important, especially I'm serving as a missionary in Asia and among the Chinese. How can I identify as much as possible with the people I'm serving? And in many ways, I think that's probably a very important biblical principle as well, because we know that Jesus Christ also came in the form of man. Whether in the Gospel of John, John chapter 1, the Word became flesh and dwelt among us. And you go and read the Gospel of John over and over again, there are descriptions of Jesus, the humanity of Jesus. He was tired, and so he sat by the by the well, there in John chapter 4. Jesus' thirst on the cross. Many, many references to the humanity of Jesus Christ and his identification with us. So I think there are some good examples, parallels there. But at any rate, he went on to serve in China, as I mentioned, for some 50 plus years. Well, that's a little bit of a story about Hudson Taylor. For myself, I was, as I mentioned, grew up in Taiwan. I was there until I was 18 years old. It was actually only 18 years old when I truly became a follower of Jesus Christ. Previous to that, obviously, maybe like many of you, my parents being Christians, my parents being missionaries, my father being a preacher, meant that we had to go to church every Sunday. It was a no-brainer. There was no option to be considered as to whether you could go to church or not. And I remember back then, everybody had church together. It wasn't a case where you had children's worship, you had youth worship. Everybody was in the sanctuary together. And so we lived in Kaohsiung, which is in the southern part of Taiwan. And every Sunday, I had to sit beside my two sisters and my mom and listen to my dad preach. He's actually a very good preacher. There was just one thing, if I wanted to complain about, is that he liked to use his children in his sermon as illustrations. And it would be okay if he used good illustrations of his children as his sermon examples. The problem was he sometimes used not so nice illustrations, especially about his son. And so, it was the case, I was always so embarrassed. And at the end of the service, these old ladies would come up and they would squeeze my cheeks. And they would say in Chinese, 代际中, which is my Chinese name, 你真是好皮, you're very So that was the context that I grew up with. But yeah, it wasn't until I was 18 years old before I truly became a follower of Jesus Christ. And that was a very significant thing in my life, just because I think I realized that while I could be born into a Christian family, In the kingdom of God, there are no grandkids. There are only sons and daughters in the kingdom of God. If you are born and raised in a Christian family, that doesn't automatically make you, or it certainly did not automatically make me a Christian. And it was only until I was 18 years old when I made that decision. A lot of different events led to me making that decision. I had a very rebellious teenage period of time, about 3 or 4 years. Very difficult for my parents. I would describe it as this: when my father would tell me to stand up, I would sit down. When he told me to sit down, I would stand up. I'm not sure they really knew how to handle this son of theirs. Very, very rebellious. I ran away from school, played hooky from school, and got a sound beating for that one. I remember that for sure, although I remember hearing my mom cry, which had a bigger impact on me than my dad spanking me, hearing my mom cry. But by 16, by 17 years old, I think I began to realize that Jamie Taylor was in trouble, and that God's work needed to take place into my life if I was going to turn my life around. Just about that time, I was invited by an organization in Taiwan. In Chinese, it's called 宇宙光, Cosmic Light. Some of you might have heard of it before. It's an organization that has about 50 years to its history, maybe a little bit more than that. But anyway, they put on a play about missionaries in China. And so they needed some people to play a missionary role. And lo and behold, they came and asked me. I'm sure my dad had something to do with that. You know, in Chinese, 关系 is everything. So I ended up becoming an actor in this play. I wasn't even a Christian then, but I became an actor in this play about these missionaries during the Boxer Rebellion, which was in 1900. There was a very grassroots kind of reaction against the West because of just some of the things that the West had done to China, or did to China throughout its history. And so this group of people they call 义和团, or boxers, they sort of raised up and caused havoc, and they killed many, many missionaries. They killed even more Chinese Christians. And so this play was about that story. And so I was a missionary, which I thought was pretty ironic, seeing how I wasn't even a Christian. And here I was playing the role of a missionary. But it was also part of just how God also continued to work in my life, because these other actors and actresses really sort of took me under their arms. 我是那个小弟弟. I was this little brother to all of them. They were all older than me. And they would really just reach out to me in a way that very much just touched my heart. And so the Lord very much used that experience as well as to mold my life and to bring me to Him. A third thing that was very instrumental was, and this was back in the day where the United States military, because Taiwan and the U.S. still had relations. That relation was broken off in 1979 during the Jimmy Carter presidency. Previous to that, even from Nixon to Ford, the U.S. military was in Taiwan. Initially, they were more involved with the Vietnam War because Taiwan was a key base to supply the Vietnam War. So there was a Navy base in Kaohsiung. There was an air base in Taichung, and then the military was up in Taipei, and they would use that to supply the war efforts in Vietnam. Well, one of the things the U.S. government did was they allowed U.S. citizens, the children of U.S. citizens, to work on the military base during the summer. And I think they did that to sort of get us out of trouble. And I still remember, don't ask me why I remember this, but I remember the wage was $1 an hour, okay, which just doesn't sound like a whole lot today. But in the early 1970s, to a teenager, $1, that was 40 NT. which could get me a lot of things. And so every summer, that's what I would do. I would work on the military base, and I would get paid for that. But the Lord also used that experience, because in my mind, these guys, they had all the money in the world. And yet, as I looked at their lives, it didn't impress me at all. It didn't make me think that they had found the answer to life, and the money that they had was truly finding the happiness that they sought in their life. And so my senior year in high school, I was led to the Lord by a missionary teacher in the school that I was studying at. And he led me in the sinner's prayer, and I accepted Jesus Christ. It really wasn't so much anything he said that I didn't know, because obviously I grew up in the church and I heard it all before. But I think the time was just right, and my heart was softened, and I realized I needed a Savior. I realized very clearly that I was a sinner. And so he led me. Mr. Powers was his name, Wendell Powers. I actually texted his wife yesterday. She's on Facebook. And because I've shared my testimony a couple of times on this trip down in Houston and so on and so forth, where we started our trip. And I was just very thankful for Mr. Powers, Wendell Powers. He was the 6th grade teacher. I was in 12th grade. But he was the 6th grade teacher, and for some reason he just took a liking to me, or took an interest in me, and decided that the Lord gave him a mission in life, and that is to lead Jamie Taylor to a saving knowledge of Jesus Christ. And so they would often invite me to their house for meals, and that's a good strategy for student ministry. You can get to the heart through the stomach. I was living in the dorm, and dorm food was no good. My parents were in Taipei, and I was living in the dorm in Taichung, which is in the central part of Taipei. But they would invite me to their home. Southern Baptist from the south, great iced tea. I still remember the best iced tea I've ever tasted before. But anyway, so very thankful for Wendell Power leading me to a saving knowledge of Jesus Christ. And then I was baptized in the pool at Morrison, the school that I was attending. And I remember Mr. Powers said to me, he said, "Jamie, because you have a lot of sins, we need more water to cleanse you." So I was baptized in the Morrison swimming pool. I don't think theologically that's probably But the amazing thing, actually, if I could just round it off, the amazing thing was 40 years later, I had the privilege of baptizing 2 of our children in the same swimming pool. My kids are 3 kids. We have 3 kids, James the 5th, and then our 2 daughters, Selena and Joy. But I had the joy of baptizing JT, we call him JT or James. I had the joy of baptizing JT and Selena in the same swimming pool. And I mean, we walked down the same stairs that I walked down when I was 18 years old. There was no, flashes of lightning. I came out of the pool, not really, oh wow, ooh, why didn't I do this earlier? I wasn't really, it wasn't like a Damascus, Paul, I suddenly got tossed off the horse. There was really nothing like that. But one thing very much stuck out in my mind, and that is after I was baptized, after I received Jesus Christ as my Lord and Savior, somebody said something to me that very much, I think, revealed the change that God was doing in my life. And what he said to me, he says, "Jamie, something is different about you." And I really couldn't put my finger on what was so different about me. I wasn't conscious of anything different. I said, "What do you mean?" And he said, "Well, you used to cuss a lot. I could cuss in English, I could cuss in Mandarin Chinese, and actually cussing in Taiwanese sounds even worse. So I could cuss in 3 languages, and I did it pretty regularly. I just had a real foul mouth." But he said, "You don't cuss anymore. What happened?" And it was only then I realized that, God had taken that out of my life. And so I believe, even though I didn't fall off a horse on the way to the swimming pool, that God began to work in my life and change my life. And so that was my conversion experience. I came to the United States for my university. And then the Lord led me down to the Bay Area, actually. And some of you, if you attended the service yesterday evening, you might have heard me share a little bit about this. But I was here in the Bay Area. I was in Berkeley for 2 years. And the Lord used those 2 years very much in my life to direct my path for my whole life. I came here to study. I was very interested in China. China had just opened up in 1980. I mentioned that Carter became president in 1978, and we formalized relations with the People's Republic of China on January 1st, 1979. And that was just a humongous impact on my life, because I just couldn't believe the U.S. would do such a thing. But anyway, I was still very interested in using my Chinese. I was convinced that the Lord wanted me to use my Chinese for my life. I didn't consider ministry at that point, much less missionary service. My Chinese name, the literal translation is, "You will follow in the path of your ancestors." And so I was asked from a very young age, "Are you going to be a missionary?" And I determined in my heart when I was 5 years old that I would do anything but be a missionary, because I got so tired of people asking me, "你是不是也要当宣教士? Are you going to be a missionary as well?" And that continued with me, even though I had become a Christian when I was 18 years old. I was still, "Lord, I'll do anything but. I'll do anything but." And that went right through college. I went to the State Department and applied for a job. I wanted to work in China. I wanted to work among the Chinese. And they basically turned me down. They said, "You have too much emotional attachment with the Chinese. You lose sort of the objectivity. And more than likely, they would probably send you to some African country." And I wasn't interested in going to Africa. And that's what they do in the State Department. You don't end up really staying long anywhere in the State Department, because they don't want you to put down roots. They don't want you to develop an emotional attachment among the people that you're living amongst. They want you to be objective. So I understand that after the fact. But that wasn't too exciting for me. I went on to apply for a job in the CIA, thinking, well, maybe I can work at their China desk in the CIA. I never got a letter so quickly back from my parents. Then when I informed them that I was applying to the CIA, this was pre-email era, and so it was by snail mail that I got a reply from my parents: "Jamie, whatever you do not apply to the CIA." So anyway, I came down to the Bay Area. I lived in Berkeley. And it was during those 2 years that the Lord really used the life testimony of a retired missionary couple, David and Ruth Aidney. David Aidney was a Brit. He graduated from Cambridge University. He was deeply impacted by the Cambridge 7. Some of you may have heard of that term. It's a group of students. Actually, this was back in the end of the 19th century. The Cambridge 7, it was 6 students actually, to be accurate. 6 students from Cambridge and somebody else. Together they constituted the Cambridge 7, and they went to China as missionaries. But they greatly impacted the West, because up to that point, the only people that went to went to China as missionaries were either pastors or lay people. Very few college students or college graduates would devote themselves to full-time missionary service. You know, they thought, well, hey, if you can get into college, that's already a huge leap, and so you would be a doctor, you would be a lawyer, you would do a lot of those things, and the thought of forfeiting a college education, if I can use that term, forfeiting a college education to be a missionary was thought to be a waste of time. And that all changed with the Cambridge 7. And so Mr. Amy was greatly affected by the Cambridge 7 and went to China. He studied in the province of Anhui, where the CIM, Hudson Taylor started the China Inland Mission, the CIM, had one of their language schools. They split up the women missionaries from the men missionaries so that they could all concentrate on language study, especially the single missionaries, without being distracted by, well, maybe my wife or my husband. And so the women missionaries went to Yangzhou, which is in Zhejiang province. Yangzhou is a Jiangsu province, thank you. In Jiangsu province, and the women went to Yangzhou, and all the men went to Anqing, which is in Anhui province, and so that's where Mr. Amy went. Mrs. Amy, they hadn't gotten married. Mrs. Amy was from the United States. But then they met and they got married, and they went to the province of Henan. And so when I met up with Mr. Amy, he was well into his 70s. He still had a very fluent, a very thick Henanese accent to his Mandarin. And if you know anything about Chinese, it's a tonal language. So we would talk about ma, 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 or zhu, 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 zhu. Most of you, I'm sure, can pick out the different tones. 1, 2, 3, 4. Ma, 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 ma. Well, each of those tones could mean something different. So ma is an exclamation. Ma is to be no. Ma is a horse, and ma is to scold. Okay? Or, for instance, the sound zhu, 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 zhu. Zhu is a pig. Zhu is bamboo. Zhu is Lord, and zhu is live. Okay, so it's a tonal language. Missionaries have a great challenge on learning Chinese, and you make a lot of mistakes in the process. But across China, different accents, they end up, the tones go all weird on everybody. And so I remember Mr. Amy, he always used to pray. And of course, he would like to pray in Chinese together with me. And forever, he would always, in referring to the Lord, instead of saying zhu, he would always say zhu, which meant pig, rather than Lord. And so he would always, dear pig, rather than dear Lord. You know, and I was a naughty little brat. Even though I was, in my early 20s, I would always, after prayer, I would say to Mr. Amy, I would say, Mr. Amy, it is not zhu, it's zhu. And he would laugh, and of course, we had a lot of fun over that. But it was really during those 2 years that the Lord opened up my heart to the possibility, that decision I made at 5 years old, that I would do anything but. And over those 2 years, Mr. Amy, we use a word mentor today that is not used very often, wasn't used very often back then. But Mr. Amy very much mentored me. I was at their home a lot. He would pray together with me. He would involve me in his ministry. I was his driver. So he would preach all across the Bay Area. And of course, he was in his 70s. And so I said, Mr. Amy, I'll drive you wherever you want to go. So we would go to Sacramento. We would go to Davis. We would go all across the Bay on Sunday. So I was his driver. I was still all very, very naughty. Mrs. Amy always thought I drove so fast. She always thought I drove too fast. But anyway, through those experiences, God just began to soften my heart to the possibility of going into full-time ministry. But I wanted to make sure, I needed that assurance and that confidence that God was calling Jamie Taylor into ministry. And just by chance, I'm a descendant of Hudson Taylor. It's just by chance that in our faith, there's nothing by chance, but I think you understand what I'm saying. And so I remember growing up hearing a lot of stories about Hudson Taylor, obviously, and hearing a lot of stories of how he trusted God and how God faithfully provided for all of his needs. They would have hardly any food left, and he would get on his knees with his wife Maria, my great-great-grandmother, and the Lord miraculously would provide food for them the very next day. Somebody would come knocking on their door, with bags of rice. So I grew up hearing about these stories. And so suddenly this thought came into my mind. In the Bible we hear about the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, the God of Jacob. It can be the God of Hudson Taylor and the God of Jamie Taylor. And if God was faithful in that generation, 5 generations ago, he can be faithful in this generation as well. And so I prayed to the Lord. I said, Lord, if you want me to go into full-time ministry, please confirm that in a very real way. And you want to call it a fleece, a Gideon's fleece or whatever. What I prayed for was that the Lord would provide for my seminary education. I wouldn't take out any loans. I wouldn't ask my parents for any money, and that the Lord would just provide for that need. And it came out to be about $30,000 a year, including room and board, which doesn't seem much today. But back then, that was a sizable sum. I certainly didn't have a whole lot of money. I was a poor college graduate. I didn't have a whole lot of money in my account. But that was my prayer. Lord, if this is your will, may you provide it to confirm that this is your will. And so Hudson Taylor used to say this: the Lord's work done in the Lord's way will not lack the Lord's provision. The Lord's work done in the Lord's way will not lack the Lord's provision. And so that was the promise I held to. I went to Asbury Theological Seminary. I applied because applying wasn't the issue. The issue was, do I have any money to go to the school? And so financial aid would send me these forms to fill out. I knew that filling out the forms meant that they said, well, you need to borrow money, you need to apply for this loan or that loan. And so every time the financial aid office would send me a form, I would tear it up and I would throw it in the waste. Just believing that, hey, if this is your will, Lord, that you will provide the way. Well, I received yet another letter from the financial aid office. Thankfully, I opened it and read it without tearing it up and throwing it into the garbage bin. Because lo and behold, this letter, a very short letter, I'm just so regretful I didn't keep it and even maybe frame it somehow. But they said simply this, that, hey, we're happy to inform you that all 3 years of your seminary education have been covered. Your tuition, your room and board, even your books. They made the mistake of telling me eventually who actually supported me through my seminary education. But it was just an amazing thing because I didn't even really know this person. They obviously got wind somewhere that I was considering seminary, but they didn't have any idea that that was the prayer on my heart. I told nobody that prayer. I didn't even tell my parents, Mom and Dad, my fleeces, the Lord will provide for my seminary, knowing that my dad would probably go and try to find some support for me. So I told nobody about that prayer. I didn't even tell Mr. Aidney about that prayer. It was just something between me and the Lord. And so probably he caught wind that I was going to seminary, and the Lord moved on his heart. Actually, a Chinese brother from Michigan. The Lord moved in his heart. Luke Shen was his name. The Lord moved in his heart to write to Asbury, direct to Asbury, and said, I want to support Jamie Taylor, and I will cover all of his tuition and all of his expenses at Asbury. I wasn't supposed to know any of that. The seminary made a mistake by inadvertently giving me his name. But anyway, that was the confirmation for me. And so I had less than $1,000 in my bank account when I left Berkeley, California, and drove my Datsun B210. Maybe some of you remember that. But I drove my Datsun B210 across the country to Wilmore, Kentucky, which is a godforsaken place. And that was the beginning of my seminary education. I shouldn't say that. It's a great class. And I'm often asked, do you feel like there's pressure being a descendant of Hudson Taylor? Is there pressure, Hudson Taylor was a missionary, his son was a missionary, his son was a missionary, his son was a missionary. Do you feel pressure on being a missionary? I can honestly say I don't feel any pressure whatsoever. Well, if I feel any pressure, it's this, that as they were faithful in their generation, my prayer is the Lord would help me be faithful in my generation. I think if there's and I think that's a good pressure, at least from my perspective, that the Lord would help Jamie Taylor be faithful in his generation as my father was faithful in his, so on and so forth. And so, but I've honestly felt no pressure whatsoever other than that of feeling I was obligated to be a missionary. Sorry, fate has it, no choice. 算你倒霉. None of that at all. And in fact, what was a burden when I was 5 years old actually became a blessing when I was 22 years old. And I went to Wilmore, Kentucky, and began my seminary education, actually in 1984. Finished seminary, went to Boston, served in the Chinese church, and then eventually we joined OMF, which used to be called the China Inland Mission, started by my great-great-grandfather, and yes, I had to apply to no Holman, you can't go the back door, I had to apply to OMF. I was sent to Taiwan as a missionary. They treated me like everybody else. They said all missionaries have to study Chinese. And I said, what? You're going to make me study Chinese? They said, no, well, can you speak Taiwanese, which is a dialect in Taiwan? I said, well, I grew up speaking Taiwanese as well as Mandarin. I used to like to watch television, and they had these puppet shows, 布袋戏. And I used to love to watch 布袋戏, these puppet shows on television, and they had the Chinese, they had captions on the bottom. So that's how I taught myself Taiwanese. And so the field director, we refer to them as a field director, he said, well, that kind of Taiwanese they don't use in churches. You need to go and learn the Taiwanese that they use in churches. And I won't bore you with examples of that. But I did not learn any church dialect, any church terminology watching puppet shows on television. So I went to Taichung, which is in the middle part of Taiwan, actually where I went to high school, and studied Taiwanese about 6 months, got enough of church lingo underneath my belt. They kicked me out of language school because I had reached, they use a level 1 to 5 scale, and if you hit 3, they kick you out. They said, well, now you just need to go out and use your language. So after 6 months, I got kicked out, went up to Taipei, worked among students, and in 1996, and I'm going much faster with the rest of all of this, 96, our family, I met Mimi, my wife. She's from Taiwan, born and raised in Hualien, which is on the east coast of Taiwan. She did her degree in voice performance, so you might have heard her sing last night, or you might have heard her just sing a minute ago. But the Lord very much gifted her in voice. She has a beautiful voice, and you're free to tell her that I told you that. I didn't tell you to tell her that, but if you by chance tell her, you can also just casually throw that one in. I appreciate it. The Lord gave us 3 kids, James the 5th, Selena and Joy, and we spent quite a few years in Hong Kong. We were working mostly in China, so I traveled in and out of China quite a bit. And then we moved back to Taiwan, where we've served ever since. 3 years ago, the Lord sort of did a real number on us in terms of direction of ministry. Up to then, we were involved with OMF. Mostly, I was doing cross-cultural missionary training. The Lord has given the Chinese church, especially the church in China, a tremendous burden for missions. I've never really, if I can very honestly say to you, I've never felt it so much from Taiwan, Hong Kong, or other parts of Southeast Asia, or even the Chinese church in America here, if you'll forgive me for saying that. I've never felt the kind of passion that the church in China has for missions and cross-cultural missions. They feel a tremendous sense of indebtedness to the missionaries, beginning with Robert Morrison, who took the gospel to China in 1807. Just an amazing story. You know that he learned Mandarin Chinese. He went in 1807. He learned Mandarin, and by 1813 he had translated the entire New Testament from Greek into Chinese. That just blows my mind. Within the span of 6 years, learning the language to a level of fluency, and obviously I realize he didn't do it all by himself, but nevertheless he was instrumental in that task. Within the span of 6 years, learning this language to a degree of fluency that he could then actually translate from Greek into Chinese and produce the first New Testament in Chinese. Just an amazing story. And 6 years later, in 1819, if I'm not mistaken, he translated the whole Old Testament as well. But the Chinese church in China, from my very limited experience, has a tremendous sense of indebtedness for these missionaries. And so their prayer is that by 2030, that the Lord would raise up 20,000 missionaries sent out into cross-cultural missions. It could be within China, because China is a multicultural country. They have 55 minority groups. They have 56 people groups, of which 55 are minority groups. So it could be within China itself, reaching the Tibetans in southwest China, reaching the Uyghurs in the northwest part of China, or even some of the minority groups in the other part of southwest China. But then going beyond China. And so their prayer is that the Lord would raise up 20,000 missionaries by 2030. Maybe you're asking, why 2030? And the simple reason is they believe that by 2030 we will actually celebrate Jesus' call into ministry, the 200th anniversary of Jesus' beginning of his ministry. Presumably he started in AD 30. So by 2030, that will be 2,000 years. And their hope and their prayer is by then, if the Lord doesn't return before then, by then there will be 20,000 missionaries sent out from China, which is just an amazing thing. And so every time I have opportunity to interact with the missionary movement in China, it just touches my heart. It just moves me very, very deeply, the burden and the desire that they have. But anyway, that was what we were involved in. We're still involved in it somewhat. But in 2020, the Lord led us to serve at CES, China Evangelical Seminary, which is a graduate level school in the capital of Taiwan, in Taipei. And 50 years CES has been in existence. It started in 1970. And I am the 8th president of the seminary, and it's a tremendous privilege. It was a huge learning curve. I went to seminary, Asbury, that God bless place. But going to seminary and leading a seminary, let me tell you, night and day, very, very different. But the Lord has given me a tremendous joy, huge learning curve. I shared this morning in the session, if Peter didn't go to Cornelius's house, he would never have learned what God's purposes were for everybody to hear the good news of Jesus Christ. God did not wait until Peter was perfect before he sent him. But it was as Peter went, I said, as we go, we grow, is how I described it. As we go, we grow. And if we don't go, we won't grow. And that's been my story the last 3 years. Huge learning curve. And I've grown a lot in my relationship with the Lord, and grown a lot in terms of ministry. Very, 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 very thankful. Maybe I could just pause there very quickly. I was told about an hour, so I think I've about hit an hour.
Hour and a half.
Who's counting, right?
But ironically, what you're
go ahead,
I was going to say, ironically, what you're doing is very much what the English congregation is doing today anyway, sharing testimonies.
Okay.
And maybe people have time to ask you questions.
Okay, good. And then I'll close. I don't have to go another half an hour. If they don't want me to go another half an hour. Okay, yeah, fair enough. Any questions, any thoughts? I don't have a whole lot of time, opportunity to interact with English congregations. I usually get shuffled off to the Chinese side. They like to see this Guilo speaking Chinese. Guilo is like literal translation, foreign devil, in Cantonese. So they like to listen to this Guilo speaking Mandarin Chinese. But let me just, I was in Houston. Every time I come to North America, including the United States and in Canada, one of the things that impresses me, or one of the things that very much is on my heart is, how can the Chinese church, which is an ethnic church, how can the Chinese church, within that ethnic kind of a context, how can that yet not limit us to only reaching the Chinese? And that's one of the strengths of an ethnic church is what we would call a homogeneous kind of a theory. That is, it's easier for us to reach people with our own language, within our own culture. And so that's the strength of an ethnic church. But so often in your life and in my life, you'll know that actually sometimes our greatest strength is also our greatest weakness. And so inadvertently, unintentionally, that kind of ethno-focus on reaching our kinsmen for Christ becomes somewhat of a limiting thing because we only reach the Chinese. But the fact of the matter is most of us engage in our daily lives with a lot of non-Chinese. Could be where we're living, it could be if you're a student, your classmates, within your work context, you're rubbing shoulders with non-Chinese as well. And so I've always felt that especially the English congregation of a Chinese church has a pivotal role to serve. I describe it as a bridge to help the ethnic church reach beyond its ethnicity. And that congregation can't do that because they're first generation. And for them to worship in Chinese, that's where they feel the freest, the most liberated. To hear a message in Chinese, that's where they feel they can receive the most. And that's okay. And so they need to do that. But for us, within an English ministry context, we actually have what I believe is a very divine role to play in terms of helping our churches reach beyond our own ethnicity. And so the church leadership needs to see that. And often the problem is the church leadership doesn't see that. And there's not a sufficient allotment of resources and a focus upon allowing the English congregation to move this church forward in terms of being able to reach beyond that ethnicity. And if you feel like a second-class citizen sometimes, my apologies to you, because I think that's unfortunate and that shouldn't be the case. And I'm very sorry if that is how you might feel sometimes. You're sort of shuffled to a smaller room and you're, all the resources are over there, which I think is a very unfortunate thing. And I truly believe that you are the answer to the ethnic church. Your role in the English congregation of a Chinese church. OBCs, that population is dwindling. That population is dwindling. But the ABC, by the way, you are ABCs and I'm a CBA. You guys are bananas and I'm a egg. Okay. You're yellow on the outside, you're white on the inside. I'm white on the outside and yellow on the inside. an insult, my apologies. I didn't refer to myself as a 1,000-year-old thing. Yeah, I very much, you guys are the key. You guys are the key. You guys are the future of the Chinese church. And how the Chinese church ceases to be so ethnically inward that we have really no impact on the society around us. And that's unfortunate. If our church was to suddenly disappear and no one noticed that we no longer were there, that's a sad testimony. And so how can we engage with the community around us? And because you're more native speaking English than I am, you're the key. You're the key. And so, yeah. Anyway, my 2 cents. So, and then I'll close with just a thought that something I shared with our graduates from CS.
Well, my question was how do we tell the Chinese side to get over themselves?
Your comments were very on point with what our congregations have gone through over the past couple of years.
Yeah. I probably won't put it in so many words, but I've on more than one occasion have admonished, have encouraged the Chinese congregation to see our English congregation in more than just a glorified youth ministry. And then there's nothing wrong with youth ministry, but we're not just a glorified youth ministry here to take care of their kids while they can do their thing. Yeah, and I've on more than one occasion probably stepped on some toes. Not sure I've not been not invited back because of that. No, yeah, I'm sure either tonight or tomorrow something will come out for sure. Maybe tomorrow, then I'm leaving, so it's
We'll be joining in the service. This time we all come together.
Okay. Sorry. No, I'm half joking, but I'm very serious, but I appreciate your comments. Yeah.
You were here 20 years ago. I was like, I was wondering, did you say something to not get invited 20 years ago?
Maybe it'll be 20 years. Yeah.
Pastor, you're bilingual, so actually I'm bilingual too, but my English is worse than you and my Chinese is worse than you, so. That's quite all right. I have a question to you, 2 questions. One, do you prefer to preach in English or Chinese and why? The second question is, my daughter is here, she's going to college next year. You have 3 kids, successful kids, I'm assuming. Do you have any parenting advice you want to give?
Not with your daughter around. I'll talk to her later. No, just real quickly on the first one. I think, because obviously a lot of my preaching has been in Mandarin Chinese. So just in terms of experience, I've preached far more times in Mandarin Chinese than I've spoken in English. So I often feel very frustrated speaking in English because it doesn't flow as well as when I do it in Mandarin Chinese. Let me give you guys an example. You guys will get a laugh out of this. I was preaching in Philadelphia. This was quite a few years ago. It was like a mission conference for a Chinese church, bilingual service, typical Friday night, Pastor Taylor preaching Mandarin Chinese. So somebody translated it in English, and so that was all very confusing because here's this foreigner speaking Chinese and a Chinese translator. And then the second evening, I think they really wanted to know if I could even speak English. So they invited me to preach in English. I was happy to do so, and then they translated it into Chinese. And I thought I did okay. I thought I did actually okay. Until after the service, a lady came up to me, shook my hand. Very, very gracious, very gracious. She shook my hand. She said, I listened to you preach yesterday. I listened to you preach this evening. I have one conclusion. English is not your mother tongue. So I have struggled with English ever since. I think I need inner healing. Parenting advice. Our parenting advice was do what you're interested in doing. Go to the school that you're interested in going to. We were not very involved in saying you have to study this or study that. What are your interests, and we'll support you. So we were probably more American when it came to that than maybe typical Chinese parents, and that's such a stereotype that I just said, but anyway, yeah. Well, we were pretty hands-off with our kids in terms of where they went to school. Obviously, probably some, they were limited somewhat just because we couldn't afford. Our daughter, our Selena, our second daughter, wanted to go to Rhode Island.
Design arts.
Design. Rhode Island Institute of Design or whatever. She wanted to go there, and obviously that was pretty much out of our ballpark. There was no way we could support her. We couldn't cover her tuition. So they were limited from that standpoint. But other than that, they decided what they wanted to study, where they wanted to go. We were pretty hands off. Yeah, is that a good answer? We can talk. You'll talk to your dad afterwards. You're in trouble. She'll get you. Yeah.
What's your word of encouragement for an English congregation who is currently perhaps living with the Chinese congregation who have not yet seen that vision that you described?
Yeah, that's a good question. That's just a real good question. Yeah. Because you're, sometimes that can be a very frustrating thing for you guys. I think, how to talk with leadership, communicate with leadership, and help them to understand. Maybe that's sometimes very difficult to do just because it seems like we're talking past each other. I think praying just that the Lord will give a vision to the leadership. Talk to them, share what's on your heart. I know a lot of ABCs have jettisoned the Chinese church. They've gone to Asian churches. They've gone to Caucasian churches, which I think is sad from a certain perspective. So I think praying and just, trying to strengthen that communication. Not easy, I know. Yeah, not easy. Yeah, thank you.
In terms of cross-cultural missions, how do you recommend that people balance between like honoring and respecting a person's culture and not being like patronizing or, white man's burdening towards?
Well, I'm not sure I can say, you do ABC and that will happen. Obviously, I think, how we present ourselves. If we go in with a holier-than-thou attitude, if we go in with a sort of a spirit of superiority, that they're somehow inferior, either culturally, educationally, whatever, I think obviously that's not the mentality, that's not the motivation, that's not the spirit that we go to that people group or to that population. If we go with that kind of attitude, it's not going to be helpful. It'll be very counterproductive. I think if we can honor that culture, there might be parts of that culture that we find not biblically based, but then I'm not sure American culture is all biblically based as well. So I think every culture comes in conflict or in crash with the gospel, and each culture needs to be redeemed, so to speak. So I think, how can we come across in a servant's attitude, in a humble attitude that doesn't allow them or doesn't make them think that we somehow look down upon them. I think what my parents did, putting us into local school, actually that impacted me deeply, as I mentioned. It actually very much influenced my parents as well, because I think the people that they were serving among saw, the typical thing is we send our kids to American school. That's the typical sort of the part of the course. And when they were actually criticized by the missionaries for doing that, sending us to the local school. But, my parents felt very strongly, two things. They wanted their kids to identify with the Chinese. And two, they wanted their children to be able to fit into the culture. And so, because I could speak Chinese, I could go to Chinese churches. and I can go to Chinese Sunday school. So I wasn't sort of left standing on the side. And so that very much impacted my parents' ministry as well, because I think those around them saw that, hey, they identify with us to the point that they're willing to put their kids into the school system that our kids are in. And so I think it really boils down to our attitude. And if we go with a sense of spirit of humility, I think that gets us beyond some of the things that, frankly, missionaries have mistakes that we have committed in the past. And we're probably still committing, which is regretful. But I think humility is the key. And our love for the people, our desire to identify with them and honor them, I think are important things. Yeah. Thank you. Yeah. Good. Well, let me just share very quickly in closing. We had our graduation, our CES graduation just this past June. And the Lord laid on my heart something to share with the graduates. And I used the acronym from FAITH to share with them, FAITH. And so I used that acronym to share with them, and I'd just like to maybe close with that as a challenge. It challenges me as well. So for F, I thought of faithful. That wherever God has called you, wherever God has called me, that the Lord would help you, the Lord would help me to be faithful, wherever that might be. The A is for available, to be available to God. God, what are you wanting me to do? What are you wanting me to be involved in, to be available? And I used the example that day as I was sharing with the graduates. I used the example of Philip in the book of Acts. If you're familiar with the book of Acts, chapter 8, it tells us the story of Philip. He went down to Samaria, shared the gospel, the Lord blessed him. Many, many people came to a saving knowledge of Jesus Christ. And then all of a sudden, in verse 26, a messenger of the Lord came to Philip and told him to arise, go on the road that leads from Jerusalem down to Gaza. That road is a desert road, in parentheses. And then verse 27, we're just told simply this: Philip got up and went. And that phrase, 飞力起身去, Philip got up and went, very much speaks into my heart of being somebody who is available to the Lord. God didn't give Philip a blueprint for his life, didn't tell him how long he was going to go, didn't tell him how long he had to stay, didn't tell him what he had to do, who he would meet. None of that is given to Philip. Just simply get up and go. And Philip got up and went. And so that availability. And so F was faithful, A was availability. The I stands for integrity, which I think is so important for the church today. The church today, including in the United States, is consistently considered to be hypocritical. Many, many people are turned off by Christianity, even here in the United States, by the hypocrisy that they see within the church. Maybe some of it is exaggerated, but probably a lot of it is right on. That our lives are not consistent. We're not living out our what the Bible tells us to live out. We say one thing, but we do something else. So integrity, I think, is so important. Integrity. The T is to be teachable. And then the H is to be humble. For a seminary president, even before I stepped into CES as the president, as Mimi and I, my wife, we traveled around, we often heard sort of this comment that, seminary, people who come out of seminary are 中文叫弯不下腰来, they can't bend over, they can't be humble. 不好用. They're not, it's not easy to use them. That doesn't sound right. They're difficult to get along with, and knowledge, Paul in 1 Corinthians tells us that knowledge leads to pride. And if our theological education is just the gaining of knowledge, it leads to pride. Pride is the sin of all sins. All sins find their beginnings in pride. And so just the importance of being humble, just the importance of being humble. And so I leave that with you, faith, F-A-I-T-H. Of course, faith is such an important thing in our belief, isn't it? That we're saved by faith. And so we not only want to be saved by faith, but we want to be people of faith. Right? We want to be people who are faithful, available, integrity, teachable, and humble. And so I leave that with you. Thank you very much. Happy to